You're listening to KYRS Medical Lake Spokane, 88.1 and 92.3 FM. And coming at you now, it's Long Waves with Gary Krug. And I thank you for joining me today on this live show. I want to say right at the beginning of the show that the opinions expressed here are solely my own and do not necessarily express the views or opinions of one of the website, kyrs.org, and begin to donate securely online. So today's show is based on a line from Hamlet, when Hamlet is ruminating on whether life or death is better, whether death would not be a release from the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. And he says, to sleep, perchance to dream, aye, there's the rub, for in that sleep of death, what dreams may come. And it's the sleep of death I want to talk about today, and the dreams that may come. You know, I walking down to the station today, beautiful day, wonderful spring day, in February, which is continues to be insane to me. But I see all the happy, purposeful people. They're out there doing stuff. They're walking, they're talking, they're going to work, they're doing their jobs. And I don't know, they all seem completely like they're just immersed in the moment. But I think we all feel that there are changes in the air, and I'm not just referring to the climate. Not spring is here. There's something bigger that's shaping up, something like climate change, but metaphorically rather than literally, although we've got the literal part of that as well. I'm reminded that, days kind of tick along, and every day is just like every other day pretty much until one day it isn't. And that's how change comes about. But there are a lot of signs and symptoms and things to be read in people and the way they act and the way they talk that suggests that a lot of people are uneasy and unsettled. On the one hand, there's a kind of nervous anxiety and action, but on the other hand, I often encounter a sense of resignation and fatalism seasoning all of people's thoughts and talk. Oh, climate change, what can we do? Oh, the government, what can we do? And yet I see people going through their daily motions. And as I was walking in, I was thinking, I often see one of my dogs doing very, very purposeful things in his sleep, especially running. You'll see their paws moving and sometimes their legs moving and their body's kind of getting into it, and they'll even bark sometimes in that muffled way of sleeping dog. Ruff, 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 and little paws are going. It's so purposeful, and they're completely asleep. Completely. And I think this is analogous to the situation in which we find ourselves today. We're dreaming an ordinary sleep for a bit longer, but it's a sleep that may come with dreams, and the sleep itself may change. It seems we cover up or displace these feelings that make us anxious, these sensibilities, that there's so many things that are just off the rail. But these perceptions and sensibilities and feelings and dreams still hover about in our minds and our hearts, and they change the color, they change the gamma, they change a lot of how we perceive the world, who we are, how we act, how we talk. So what's going on? The world's always been corrupt. I mean, it was ever thus. The world has always been corrupt. Governments have always lied, right? Including, and perhaps especially, the United States. And I talked last week about the kind of schizoid mentality living in the U.S. gives us, maintaining these two histories of who we are that don't fit very well together. And countries such as the U.S., and perhaps again especially the U.S., have always undertaken wars of conquest for false reasons, lied about what they were doing when it was really about conquest. It was really about not spreading democracy but destroying it so that countries would be more pliable to corporate interests. And the rich have always run the world. So what's different now? Why are we more affected by these things? Well, on the one hand, we could ask, are they more prominent? Are they more common? Well, yes and no. There are, it seems to me, three things that have changed in the world. And the first is the scale of the problems facing us. We're no longer talking about a seasonal drought. We're talking about global climate change, the transformation of the world from this lovely place that it's been for our species to grow up in and evolve in and survive in and thrive in, to a place that's going to be much less hospitable to us. So that's a huge scale problem. We have the scale problem that conflicts can easily morph into large wars, world wars, regional wars, nuclear wars. Nuclear wars, that's a game changer. And we have also a change of scale in how embedded we are in the economies, how embedded we are in economic systems, very complex economic systems that are, at the same time, extremely fragile. They're computerized, they're intermeshing, they're linked to other markets, manipulations of markets that we can't even know or begin to understand can wipe out the wealth of a nation in a few milliseconds. And that was hard to do before. So we've got that uncertainty hanging over us. We also have an erosion, though, of a sense of community and a belonging in the social for many people, which is heightened by a sense of the threat of instant expulsion from the society for economic or social or political reasons. So, for instance, you lose your job, suddenly you lose your house, then you have no place to live, you lose your car, or you're living in your car, and in just a very few moments, your whole life can be destroyed, transformed completely, so that you're no longer actually even in society. You don't have an address, you don't have a phone number, you have nothing that supports who you are. Social reasons, we find all kinds of social reasons to expel people. They're the wrong color, they're the wrong religion, they came from the wrong nation, they've got the wrong papers on them, they have the wrong sexuality. We've always got a reason to expel somebody. And then political reasons. Let's not forget that in the early part of the 20th century, during the right after the Palmer raids in 1919 and 1920, that some 250 Americans were thrown onto a ship, including Emma Goldberg, a ship that was nicknamed the Red Ark, and they were packed off to Russia to get them out of the U.S., those Bolsheviks. Or you can be locked up on what are essentially political reasons. And let's face it, given the disparities of imprisonment in race, in crime type, the prison system we have here is hugely politically biased. So these are some things that make people unsettled in their world. A second issue that we face is the simple amount of information that we receive all the time, or can receive all the time, and most people do. They seem to have their heads stuck down in those little tablets and phones, because whatever's happening there is so much more interesting than what's happening anyplace else. So we have this enormous amount of information, and it has some strange paradoxical effects, because on the one hand, it can threaten beliefs that you hold dearly, because news can come through, something from Facebook can come through, somebody's post can come through that challenges or threatens or undermines some cherished belief that one has. And this can happen several times in a day. This didn't used to happen in the old days. You might hear about something once a week or so, or once a month or so, but this constant shifting and questioning of one's beliefs, of one's sense of how things work, is much more common. Now, the other part of the paradox is that we can also easily find things that support our beliefs, so that we end up hunkered down in silos of like-minded people. And indeed, people who tend to watch Fox News and a handful of other conservative sources. And there's good research on this. And people who watch liberal news, MSNBC I guess would count, although it doesn't seem very far to the left to me. These people tend to also pursue that news source and a few related sources. It is a rare person who does wide reading across a range of bits. So you can find ideas that threaten you, but also ideas that support you, and you can choose to lock yourself into either of those positions. So you're either, kind of constantly being challenged, or you're constantly being affirmed. And if you're constantly being affirmed, you're just locked down. You're just holding on to what you're holding on to and hoping nothing weird happens. So that's part of the second answer here, the amount of information. There's also a question of the immediacy of the information that we get. Electronics, the web, TV, it's all very quick. There's no delay to it. Often we get raw feed. I remember when the earthquake hit Japan and wiped out the Fukushima Daiichi plant, the nuclear reactor there. They just interrupted what was on TV and put up live feed with no explanation, which I love. I think that's the purest form of news. Just show me the feed. I'll figure it out. But we get a lot of that, and it's so immediate that we don't have time to process the enormous volume of that information. And then there's the amount of news we get globally. We have sources that we never had before. We can watch Russian news. We can watch Iranian news. We can watch Venezuelan news. We can watch Canadian news, Australian news, read their papers. When I was growing up, we had one paper in town. And if you were really broad-minded, you might read a paper from 200 miles away. Maybe from Memphis, or maybe the Times-Picayune down in New Orleans. But all of this is easy now, so this expands the range of ideas to which we can be exposed. And these compress and buffet the sphere of reality that a lot of people have. Now, there's a third thing that I think that has changed for us in the last 50 years or so, that makes the world more threatening, more destabilizing to individuals and to communities. And that's the lack of supports for the psyche and for community itself. Let's face it, we've largely reduced our culture to a question of economics and policing. Economics are everything, as I said in the first example. You can easily be expelled from society, and indeed from the communities that you're in, for economic reasons, and those can happen very quickly. And policing is to keep the social what it is, to prevent sudden change, to prevent dramatic change, to prevent drastic change, to keep people from demanding change. I mean, that is, at the end of the day, the purpose of policing. It was always there to support the structures that are. But now the structures that are not really our structures, if they ever were. The structures of power, the structures of economics, the structures of corporations and government. That's what policing does. We also have a lack of supports for the psyche and the social in mass media generally, and I tend to call all of it pornography. There's so many forms of media that are just indistinguishable from porn. Sports for me looks just like porn. The same kinds of flash, the same kinds of unrealistic representations, the commodification of people, the playing for a cheap gratification. And there is, of course, a lot of sexualization on TV and objectification that goes on. This tends to destabilize the social as well because it models for us templates of thinking and feeling, ways of thinking and feeling and behaving that don't contribute to viable historical sorts of social relations. And TV's full of what the Germans would call Schadenfreude, taking pleasure in someone else's pain. Oh, thank God that isn't me. So all those hillbilly shows that they put on the cable TVs, all of that stuff. A lot of people watch it just for the Schadenfreude effect of it, and some of it I won't even mention by name. It's so awful. And then there's the outrageous, just the crazy thing. It's like Japanese game shows, which you can't even describe. It's like trying to describe anime. It just doesn't work. In all of these, the mind is untethered from pre-existing cultural forms that in the past would provide a sense of stability, a sense of continuity, a sense of connection with others who are understanding the same sorts of social forms and narratives. There's a stability and there's a sanity in that. But these are largely lost too, as a consequence. So these three things, the scale of problems, the amount of information, and the lack of supports for the psyche, that we don't have community. We don't go talk to our neighbors generally when we're having a problem. We hire an expert, a psychologist, a child welfare person. It's this sort of change. So that everything shifts into the sphere of economics. Everything has to be bought. Even community has to be bought. Wasn't that the whole idea of Starbucks? So knowledge, understanding, an aesthetic sense of the world, meaningful and consistent ethics, these are what we forfeit. These are the things that we no longer have access to. And, as a consequence, we see so much going on in the world that is incomprehensible to us. Or if we did try to understand it, if we did try to accept it, it would upset us terribly. Just terribly. Even though it might be precisely what we need to hear. Just this last week, I was reading a statement by the Hezbollah Secretary General, Nasrallah, called "The Game is Over in Syria." And last week, I talked about the game was over in Egypt. So the game is over in Syria. And there are a couple of bits. Here we have President Obama asking for funding for ISIS, and the talk is, how much funding should we give them? How much authorization should we give the president? How many troops? How many planes? How many bombs? How long should it last? And there's also the question of funding Ukraine. And both of these are extremely problematic, but we fall back into putting them into very simplistic little boxes and not seeing the complexities that would emerge if we simply heard the other voices that were speaking. So let me read you a few words from Hezbollah Secretary General Nasrallah. And I'm just going to skip around through it a bit because there's lots of it that just isn't germane here. When he talks about what's going on in the Middle East, he says, these are new wars and fronts. Whom are they serving? For whose interests are they fighting? Here, and for the first time, I dare say, consider the Israeli Mossad, the CIA, and British intelligence. Previously, we did not pose the theory of a conspiracy. But now, we say let's take that into consideration. Everything that the Takfiri, the Muslims who aren't Muslims, everything that the Takfiri current and Daesh do, Daesh is ISIL, or ISIS, so everything that the non-Muslim Muslims and ISIS do serves Israel, he writes. Israel's hegemony over the region and U.S. hegemony over the region. They're also provoking Europe. Imagine, for example, that a couple of days ago, Italian defense minister said, we're ready to lead an international coalition against terrorism in Libya. And between the parentheses, we asked the Italian defense minister, why do you want to lead an international attack on terrorism in Libya? Listen well to the answer of the Italian defense minister. He says, terrorism is only 350 kilometers from the Italian border. Only 350 kilometers. The defense minister of Italy and the European Union are civilized. They're still thinking of staging a military action against Libya because terrorism is now 350 kilometers away. As for us, terrorism is on the barren mountains at the border. Terrorism is on our hills and in bomb-laden cars. Before this status quo, which is in fact not exaggerated, there is a truth called a serious true danger. The threat was Syria. Now it is Syria and Iraq. It also reached Libya. And he goes on and talks about the spread of this terrorism. And he says this of Daesh, ISIS, this is a true threat. They're slaughtering and killing. These are not films. They're producing true films. It is absolutely certain that their mind, spirit, and brutality come from Hollywood. This is the culture of Hollywood. Is there anything other than killing and slaughtering? Is this from here, from the Orient, from Islam, from Christianity, from prophets, from the Caliph, from the companions of the prophet, or from the household of the prophet? God forbids. It's not from any of these. So you can see what he's doing here. He's pointing out ISIS, and he's saying, look, ISIS is not an Islamic institution. ISIS is not, its origins are not Islamic. Its practices are not Islamic. They're not. And this is the Secretary General of Hezbollah. And he calls on Arabs and Muslims. He says, here I'm saying, I call on everyone, on all Muslims, to defend their religion, no matter if they are scholars, authorities, journalists, or authors. So arms are not a must. The worst deformation in human history for a divine religion is what ISIS is perpetrating now. The entire world, or at least states in our region, which are living this threat and this danger, must tell some regional states who are still supporting ISIS with arms and money and facilities and media that the game is over. Third, and this is very important, we must not fool ourselves or allow anyone to fool us to try and differentiate between ISIS and al-Nusra. As we have always said in the past, they are one reality. They have the same essence, ideology, culture, spirit, goal, conduct. He calls for Iraqi unity. He says the game is over in Syria. This is General Nasrallah of Hezbollah, the Secretary General Nasrallah of Hezbollah. But here's the bit that I find especially interesting. And it goes to the heart of the problem of making sense of our world and threatening ideas. Saying that America wants to get rid of ISIS is disputable. Who says America wants to get rid of ISIS? Have a look at the status quo and see how it is to the interest of America under the pretext of America defending the states of the region. This is a conspiracy of regimes. They lowered the price of oil and opened fire on themselves and all their friends and foe. It is robbing the oil of the region and the wealth of the region. Hundreds of billions of dollars are being robbed under the pretext of the burden of war. Through ISIS only, America is robbing our oil and wealth. America is exhausting us as well as our armies, peoples, states, and nerves. Through ISIS, America is planting grudges and enmities, which might not end in decades. It's ruining the entire region for its interests and for the interests of keeping Israel powerful, prominent, and protected. Why is America in a hurry? If America finds out that it wants to get rid of ISIS, it can still do that slowly and later on. And when the American presidential elections approach, so why should they get rid of ISIS now? And he actually goes on to say that the U.S. will wait until the presidential elections, and then the Democratic president will launch major attacks against ISIS. So here is a gentleman in Lebanon who has a very interesting take on what's going on in the world. And he accurately describes how most of the world sees the U.S. actions in the Middle East. It's what Pepe Escobar, who writes for the Asia Times, refers to as the empire of chaos. Empire of chaos. ISIS is our enemy, right? Okay. Iranian news, Fars, reports that the Iraqi army no less, shot down 2 British planes that were carrying weapons for ISIS. And this is interesting. And the Iraqi parliament apparently has asked London for explanations because they were UK planes that were carrying these Western munitions. Quoting from an Iraqi provincial official, "We have discovered weapons made in the U.S., European countries, and Israel from the areas liberated from ISIL control in the al-Baghdadi region." And they have photographs, and they have wreckage, and they have things. There are proofs, he says, and evidence for the U.S.-led coalition's military aid to ISIL terrorists through airdropped cargoes. And he goes on to talk about some of the airstrikes, which were not nearly so precise as they might have been. And some of in other words, they missed main ISIS bodies, main ISIS leaders, and saying that the U.S. actually had the intelligence to do that right, but it's not to the interest of the U.S. The U.S. State Department, U.S. Defense Department rather, said that it had airdropped 28 bundles of weapons and supplies to the Kurds near the Turkish border in northern Syria, but some of the weapons fell to ISIS. Now, maybe that was a mistake. It's certainly a possibility. Or maybe it was deliberate. And what about these 2 planes that were just shot down, apparently by the Iraqis, 2 British planes, 2 UK planes, loaded with equipment for ISIS? Regardless of, and I have no way of determining if this story is true, false. I have no way of knowing. I can't do it. But what I can do is look at the story and go, well, this actually makes a kind of sense, even though it's a very difficult sense to wrap one's head around. It fits into this emerging chaos perpetrated largely by the United States and the neocons who've burrowed their way into the State Department. We had a failed coup in Venezuela just this last week. We have escalating tensions and military posturings going on in Ukraine. And it's all about ISIS, which is most people in the Middle East, I'm reading, and a lot of smart people around the world are saying, well, ISIS is in fact a U.S. creation and is certainly being run to the benefit of the U.S. Whatever they're doing is not terribly helpful for ISIS. So lots of talk of war globally. And here we had this film about, American Sniper, huge grossing film. Huge grossing, enormously popular with a lot of people. Other people were kind of freaked out and horrified by it, but enormously popular with some. The popularity of films speaks to where the psyche is. It speaks to where the mind is, what the orientation of the mind is. When war films rise to the top of the box office, there's something going on. As Carl Jung put it, when Wotan saddles his horse Sleipnir, expect war. Carl Jung also said if he'd never studied a day of history, he could have predicted World War I from the dreams of his patients. And it's not just that we see war posturing. And even those among us who do not pay great attention to the news, even if we don't see war posturing, we see tension, we see threats, we see the U.S. talking about the need for more war, the need for wars that don't end, the grave threat of Ukraine, and all of this. So there is that psychic pressure, and there's also the kind of, I don't even know how to talk about it without sounding strangely mystic, the kind of understanding of a world that is unconscious. It's an understanding we get our intuitions, our feelings, our vague thoughts, the dreams that blister our sleep. Our antennae pick up a lot of things that our consciousness can't process or even become aware of. And we see this certainly in ordinary folk, but and they're corollaries to people in high places, but the experiences are different because the ones in charge think they're doing something. They are so deluded. They really think these actions are going to work out well. And ordinary people have the choice of either saying, well, I have no reason to say this, but I think you're wrong, or going along, however reluctantly, with whatever the powers that be want to provide. Now, other than signs and dreams and grim ruminations about war, we also see the reemergence of forces and groups and movements around the world. Move ISIS aside for a minute. Let's talk about the emergence of fascism and nationalism and extreme conservatism, and conservatism beyond the word conservative, in countries like Germany, France, and especially Ukraine, and other countries in the Eurasian region. Strong nationalist forces, and these only bubble up, these only gain popularity when times are really dire. When people don't know what's going on, when people feel threatened, when people don't know who they are, who the people around them are, and they feel threatened by lots of vague forces, we make the simplifying move in our minds and in our social interactions of simplifying it along lines of race, color, ethnicity, nation. And this emerges again and again and again in these waves. Whenever there's great psychic and social and military and governmental unrest, we see these movements. The Privy sector, the right sector in Ukraine, the Azov battalion. We see the Le Pen movement. We see a resurgence of neo-Nazism in Germany. We see it in a lot of places. When times are dire, when the threads that bind people together in communities, when the hands that reach out to others in solidarity, friendship, love, philia, caritas, are withdrawn or blocked, people seek another way to define who they are. And look around. Look around. There are towns in the U.S., particularly in the South and Southwest, that are outlawing homelessness. There are towns in the U.S. that are outlawing feeding the poor. That's a war on community. That's a war on charity. That's a war on Caritas, that's a war on love. Above all, it's a war on subsistence against those who have nothing. No roof, no bed, no home, no hearth, and no threshold marking the historically sacred separation of the home from the world. And this happens in conservative areas of the country, in Florida, in Texas, in Arizona, in Southern California. That's where we see these reactions among the people who are often the most visible Christians out there. And I'm sure real Christians would be appalled. But a war against subsistence, a war against love itself. It's a war against everything that would allow people to live outside of the systems of welfare, that would allow people to live outside the systems of the state and all of its attendant identifications and cards and rules and reportings. It's a war against people living outside of the financial and economic system. You must have a credit card. You can do nothing without a credit card. You must have a bank account. It's a war against the protections of law. Not the enforcement of law, but the protections of law. You may not have what is mine. You may not take it without action. You may not lock me up and disappear me to some foreign country. I have the protection of law. But we've had a war against that, and that's gone. And of course the banks can steal your house. And of course they're going to steal pensions. And of course they're going to steal Social Security. Because that's what banks do in a war against everything. In some states you can't even have a house off of the power grid because the power companies don't make enough money then. So this is another symptom and also a cause, but it's another symptom of the world that we live in, that we have this attack on one of the areas of ancient stability and healing and support, which is the community. The community and the fundamental human right to be able to subsist. Just like Brazil bulldozed the hand-built, homemade shanties and shacks of the formerly homeless in Rio before the World Cup. Bulldozed these things. These people went to dumps. They went to dumpsters. They pulled out cardboard and pieces of plastic and pieces of plywood. And they made places where they could live. That is subsistence. And bulldoze it. Or the people who had lost their jobs and were living in cars outside of Sacramento, California on a little creek that was out of the way. Well, no, y'all got to move on. You can't be here. Even though you have a kind of community here and there's a sort of support going on, we can't have this. We can't have this. And in the legal domain, we don't have, as I said, we have not the protection of law. What we have in legality is our fealty as subjects, not what the law as it stands provides us, but the power to strip us of what we have under the guise of law. Now, if you think back, there was a poem back in the 17th century when the commons in England, common land that anyone could farm, anyone could graze a cow on, and they weren't owned by anybody. It was just common space. And the commons were enclosed in fences. It was called the Great Enclosure. They would enclose the commons in fences, and then they would become the property of some landowning aristocrat. And a lot of people saw this for what it was. It was theft. And there was a poem at the time, and I'll read you the last stanza. It says, "The law locks up the man or woman who steals a goose from off the common, but lets the greater thief go loose who steals the common off the goose." And isn't that exactly what we have? You steal a TV set, you're going to jail. You steal hundreds of millions of dollars, you're going to get a bonus. And this creates precisely the kinds of conditions that I'm talking about, these splits, these confusions, these contradictions in a culture that shouldn't be there. And it's very hard for people to live in such a state. Nothing. And if we take this idea and extend it overseas, if we extend it to the rest of the world, that things can just be taken, that there is no law, that you can make war on subsistence, that the wealthy can take whatever they want, then the conclusion is that nothing belongs to anyone in the world that may not be stolen by us for our masters. The wars we're currently engaged in and the wars we're in the process of birthing have no benefit for any living creature on earth. The wealth and lives and life itself and everyone on the planet are transformed into a resource, or is transformed into an offering to the dark forces, to dark hearts. Black shirts, literal and metaphoric. The coup in Venezuela, the attempted coup in Venezuela, the U.S. and Canada had their hands all over it. And the Venezuelans found out and stopped it, found out and interrupted the plan before it got too advanced. But there's nothing about that in U.S. press. There's nothing about that in the major news. And what are the Venezuelans? Venezuela is a tiny little country. What are the Venezuelans supposed to do? I mean, the day before the revelations of the coup, opposition leaders released a transition plan which involved privatizing the country's oil, deregulating the economy. Right? Privatizing the country's oil, which means it could be bought by Chevron or Exxon or BP, and deregulating the economy to get the International Monetary Fund in there to basically own the country, bankrupt it, Naomi Klein's disaster capitalism, and remove the president by force. But the army stuck with the president, which is kind of surprising because usually the U.S. is pretty good at getting the market, getting the army on side. And one of the pieces I was reading lately by Andrei Vicek, called "Another Year, Another Coup Attempt in Venezuela, the U.S. Failed Again." Yeah, he's writing in this kind of stunned sense that this goes on. This goes on. He says, quote, "What shocks me suddenly is this silence, this calm all over the world, as if nothing really has taken place, as if nothing is going on. Is the monstrous fascist and market fundamentalist system going to get in the way of absolutely everything? It has already murdered some 60 million people since the end of World War II, as I explained in my recent book with Noam Chomsky. The empire overthrew every decent government in Africa, in the Middle East, Asia, and until recently in Latin America. It liquidated peaceful and secular Muslim governments and replaced them with thugs or extremists. It is no secret. But then when the same banditry takes place again and again, everybody stays seated on his or her bum, silent like a buffalo." So this is the famous democracy, the one that the West wants to export and sticks down the throat of the Chinese, the Russians, the Latin Americans, The establishment can butcher millions of people in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in Somalia, in Libya, Afghanistan, Iraq, Palestine, Papua, Kashmir, Syria, Ukraine. It can attempt to overthrow any democratically elected government in Latin America. But the citizens of the empire are so pacified, really, that they don't even recognize what is happening in front of their eyes. And if they do recognize it, they don't care. If they do recognize it, they don't care. He's talking about us. And he goes on and says sanctions should be brought against the U.S. by South America, which would be entertaining, ineffectual, but entertaining. Another one of those little waves that kind of trickles through our consciousness, disturbs things a little bit, and somehow we're able to repress it. And we have a lot of tricks for doing that. We have a lot of tricks. The symptoms that we experience as a culture emerge from the damage we've done by the way that we refuse to live, but choose to kill or choose to die. And the first thing that dies is our own conscience. And through the deaths of our own conscience and the theft of the resources of others, we lose our soul. We lose our heart. We lose our minds. We shield ourselves from realizing this through a split consciousness, the divided self, the duality of mind. But we also use the most common but disingenuous trick of all, convincing ourselves of our own goodness. And we see this everywhere, this fervent defense of traditional values, of religion, around religion and race and sexuality and ethnicity and class. We have Brian Browns and Pat Robertsons and veritable armies of demagogues who cannot see the fallacy of condemning others in the name of a religion founded on love. For that is not their religion. They've cherry-picked what they want out of favored selections of an ancient book in an attempt to gild themselves in a patina of spirituality while espousing hate. And ultimately, their religion does two things, and it does them very well. It puts money in their pockets because they scare lots of folk and upset them and tell them the only way they're going to get better is to tithe and tithe them. And it supports power. So we see all of these various forms of religious purity. And not just religious purity, purity across the board, the purity of the blood, the purity of the race. And we see that in Ukraine, but we also see it here in a variety of subtle forms. And race is here mainly a metaphor of nation. America. And, of course, the purity of religion. And then we have another thing that confuses, well, it doesn't confuse me, I scratch my head over it, is this push for the purity and sanctity, so-called, of women. And women are held to have to be much more pure and holy than men are because we can excuse men's behavior being men. So let me work out the logic here. So it's supposed to work like this. They need women to be pure for men so men can lead women, even though men are more sinful, but women are somehow fallen and flawed, so it all balances out in the wash. You know, Christianity historically has a very schizoid, split, confusing, and contradictory position about women, which I've never actually been able to sort out. But we have purity, the purity and sacredness of the unborn, stopping abortions. But back up a minute. This is not really a fight to protect life. It's a symbolic fight. It's a symbolic fight which reflects that those who picket the clinics and who murder the doctors and pass laws to give the state control of women's bodies, while vilifying the state, mind you, for daring to extend equal rights to gays and to the employment of migrants. It's a fight around the changes they see in their world and the changes that they see in their future. Right? The people who get all fired up about saving the children. We must save the children, especially the unborn ones. These are the people. These are the people who obsess and fixate on preventing abortions, not because they've actually worked out somehow that the unborn are people or whatever. Again, they'll cherry pick some scripture over it. But these fetae, these embryos, are symbols of things in the world around which very powerful and unconscious mental forces can coalesce. These people do not seek to save children, and this has been amply discussed and noted by many, but rather they seek to give expressions to feelings of which they are not even conscious. They've lost faith in a future, any future. They've lost faith in a future. Or it'd be more accurate, I think, to say that they fear a loss of connection with the future. So in trying to save the unborn children, they're seeking to allow a future to come into existence, even as they deny every sign of that future. Like climate change. Like how can you deny the changes we see globally going on in politics and climate change, in this headlong rush over a cliff that the West seems absolutely heart set on, and still believe you have a future? It's a very threatening idea. A lot of people can't see their way past it. I get that. And one of the things that a lot of people do is they will focus on a fear of being separated from children, a fear of being separated from children, not of their children dying, but of being separated, because children are bound up in a way symbolically with the future in a very profound way for us. And I found this out doing some research among people who were looking for an earthquake once upon a time. And I couldn't figure out why all the folks kept saying to me, I'm worried about being separated from my children. And then I realized that their town was dying. And eventually all of these stories would come back together. So a people who perceive their culture as in decline, who perceive their nation as in decline, a people who perceive their world and their existence as in decline, might well seek to fixate and obsess about saving children. And this drives us absolutely mad. To lose faith in your future because your present doesn't work and you have no control. Because your present is constantly being deconstructed. Because so much of what we live is a lie. And the things that would support us in actually surviving this lie have been destroyed or are being destroyed through the wars on subsistence, through the wars against the homeless, the wars against brown and black people, and then the wars that we have just for fun and money, like we're having in the Middle East and like the one they're ginning up in Ukraine. If Washington gets its way, we will have a major war in Eurasia by next summer. If Washington gets its way. They think Russia will back down. Russia will not blink. We will have a major war if the neocons get their way. We're already sending military equipment. We're laundering it like drug money through the United Arab Emirates. But We're already doing this. If you live in a schizoid culture where the beliefs about what the world is that you function by every day are demonstrably unraveling, if you live in a schizoid country where the national ideals are mocked by the actions of the people in power and denigrated to the point of meaninglessness, you must feel a sense of apprehension about the future. And we have a couple of options here. We can either go back to sleep and pretend it's not happening, or we can wake up. Now, if we go back to sleep, if we stay in our unconscious state and refuse to deal with what our minds are plainly telling us, why so many of us need sleeping pills, why so many of us need tranquilizers, why so many people express a sense of despair and anxiety and ennui. These are all symptoms. We can go back to sleep, but we won't be able to hide from the symptoms. They will grow, and they will grow, and they will grow. Throw nature out with a pitchfork, she always comes back again. The rest of the world talks openly about the madness of the West, and particularly our country, the U.S. The madness of the U.S., our duplicity as a nation, our greed, our destruction. And as we cannot admit these simple observations, we will feel more isolated, more surrounded by enemies, more schizoid, and in need of more defenses and projections. And projections are those parts of the psyche we cannot admit about ourselves, our dark sides. We tend to see it in other people. It's a corollary of love at first sight, but it's hate at first sight, an irrational, unconscious hatred of the other that is a projection of our own dark side that we can't come to grips with. So as we become more isolated and more schizoid, we will do that more and more. And we will incessantly find ourselves in others in a dark and inverted form. And the seeking out of those who remind us of our failings and shortcomings becomes an obsession. As truth seeks to burst into our awareness, we fight harder against it. And we will seek to tighten our definitions of purity and loyalty and patriotism and race and religion, so the divisions among us, between us, and the divisions between us and others in the world will become even more pronounced and more violently asserted and more violently defended. So, we can stay asleep and hope that the only happy outcome of that is that the war against life itself succeeds. Or we can wake up. We can stay asleep and sleep that sleep of death. And in that sleep of death, what dreams may come. As for me, I think I'm going to wake up again. You've been listening to Long Waves with Gary Krug here on KYRS Medical Lake Spokane, 88.1 and 92.3. I thank you so much for listening today. You can email me at longwaves@kyrs.org. Find it on Facebook, Long Waves Radio, and there will be links to podcasts of recent shows there. Again, thank you for listening, and do take mind of the fund drive that will be starting this Sunday. We really need everybody's support. Until next week, I'm out of here.